Hi, everyone, and welcome to the TestMuse Digital SAT Writing Series, Lesson 1, which is Basic Transitions. I'm Matt Kleinsteiber, of course, excited to be with you for this very important lesson. I say it's important because transitions actually take up a big chunk of the Digital SAT's writing section. And really, if you just think about the test as a whole, or the reading writing section as a whole, these are quite an important part. We have four kind of separate groups of questions in our reading writing modules. And one of those is called expression of ideas. And that's the last group of questions. So that's one of the categories that questions belong to. Transitions and the next type of question we'll talk about, which are bullet point questions or rhetorical synthesis questions, both belong to that category. So realistically, these make up around an eighth of all the questions on the exam in the reading writing modules. Let's go ahead and get started. So our goals for today, I want us to think about the basic types of transitions that are out there. And guys, when I'm saying transitions, I mean transition words and phrases like for example and however. And we'll think about how they kind of connect ideas between sentences. We're going to think about different categories of transitions, like adding information transitions, furthermore, moreover. If you guys aren't familiar with those words, don't worry. We'll go through all those one by one. Those that show cause and effect, like therefore and thus, and those that show contrast, like however and nevertheless. And then we're going to do a deep dive into addition transitions because that's actually the broadest category of transitions, and there are subcategories within those addition transitions. So there's stuff like moreover, right, which just is kind of a pure addition, and then there's stuff like for example, which is showing us specific examples. So that would be an example or specifics transition. We also have emphasis transitions like indeed and restatement transitions like in other words. Okay, so a lot of different categories that we're going to be working with, and actually we'll build on these categories in the next lesson. So this is a two-part transition series. I've devoted this much time to it because it is such a big part of the test, as we'll see. So we will typically see 2 to 4 transitions questions on a digital SAT reading writing module. You may see just one rarely or as many as 6. That often happens actually in the easy modules where you're getting up to 6, the easy second module. So just be aware of that. These are the second to last group of questions on the DSAT, okay, right before your bullet point questions, which we'll officially call rhetorical synthesis questions. So you always know where to expect these because they come right after your grammar or standard English conventions questions and right before those bullet point questions. They always say which choice completes the text with the most logical transition. So that's a dead giveaway. There should be no surprise that you're dealing with a transition word question. Easy to identify. It has that wording. All the answer choices are transitions. The only place that you could get maybe a little bit confused, and I'll probably swing back around to this in when I talk about standard English conventions, is there are some standard English conventions questions that actually have transition words like however in them, and they're pairing them with parts like punctuation. For example, a semicolon or a period around a word like however. If you see semicolons, periods among your answer choices, you're not dealing with a transitions word question, okay? Because transitions word questions only have commas. Okay, this might become clearer as we proceed, but I just want to warn you that just because you see, you know, so for a transitions word question, you're dealing with all different transition words in the answer choices. For some grammar questions, you'll have like one transition word, like however, and then different punctuation options around it. So don't think that you're doing the same thing there. We'll cover those actually separately in an entire lesson. That's called transitions and boundaries, and we'll get to that. All right. So we're trying to kind of bridge a gap between two sentences, and we're just picking a transition word or phrase that does that, right? To help the reader um, understand the logical flow of the information that's being presented, right? So we've already seen examples of these words, however, therefore, There are a lot of these words, honestly. And actually, this course doesn't have enough time to cover all of the words that are out there, but we will cover the most commonly seen, probably 95% of them. All right, let's talk about core transitions categories. So, really, I want you to think about three key categories when you're thinking about transitions. You'll think about addition, so you're just adding information on, right? You'll think about contrast, where things are going against one another. Um, I like chocolate, but my little sister does not, right? So that shows contrast between us. And then cause and effect. I like chocolate, therefore, I bought some at the store, right? So reasoning and kind of thinking about a result. So the transitions within those categories play very similar roles, right? And many are directly synonyms, meaning they have the same meaning. And so you can, thus and therefore mean exactly the same thing, as does hence, right? So if you know that, occasionally, and this has become rarer on the DSAT, it was actually more common on the paper-based SAT, you'll see two transitions that have the same meaning, letting you eliminate them both, right? If two things do the same thing, neither could be right on the SAT. But it's still good to think in categories, and we'll explore why. So let's talk about addition transitions. So these are transitions used to introduce additional information. By the way, this comic will make sense in just a moment. So we're bringing on stuff, and I've already kind of introduced these, like moreover, furthermore, in addition, additionally, right? They have a lot of these have addition right in the name, so pretty easy to see. Um, and you're introducing information that kind of follows in that same pattern or thread that was already started. So the Paraha language has a number of unusual qualities. Okay. It lacks fixed words for numbers or colors. Okay. Interesting. So it doesn't have number or color words. Moreover, it has a very limited number of distinct sounds. All right. So now the comic makes a little bit of sense, right? Three of the green ones, well, this language doesn't have fixed words for numbers or colors. So this gentleman saying, I don't get it. Um, as we're thinking about this example, first of all, okay, we learned in that second sentence, right? It lacks fixed words for numbers or colors. We saw like an example of the unusual qualities of this language, right? And then we're just adding in another example using moreover. Now, of course, we could have used furthermore or in addition or additionally here. They all mean the same thing. They're all part of that same category and they're synonymous, meaning that they could be replaced with one another. So in addition, I'm adding a second point, right? Interestingly enough, I could have said, for example, here, right? Right up here. It has a number of unusual qualities. For example, it lacks fixed words for numbers or colors. Moreover, it has a very limited number of distinct sounds. So transitions, it doesn't have to appear. It just helps clarify um, the reader's understanding of the passage. So I hope that makes sense. Um, but notice that I couldn't say, for example, to replace moreover. Okay. That wouldn't make sense because this is not an example of the fact that it lacks fixed words for numbers or colors. If I wanted to add an example and I'd have to say something like, for example, it doesn't have a word for green. Okay. So often you're seeing one point brought in, and then you're just adding another point that follows on the same kind of logical path that that first point did. So just to summarize these transitions, these addition transitions, basically tell reader, I can expect more information like the information that came before this sentence. All right, let's move on to contrast transitions. And again, that comic is going to make sense in just a second here. So contrast, obviously the most common contrast word is just however, right? And however functions pretty much like but does, okay? It just shows that kind of distinction between two situations. We've also got, on the other hand, nevertheless, and by contrast. And by contrast has contrast right in it, so it should be easy to see. But these are showing us differences, right? Um, and you could also think about them as showing like opposing views. I think chocolate is delicious. However, my brother thinks it's disgusting, for example. So let's look at a more test style example. So Northern Chinese cuisine emphasizes wheat-based dishes and hearty flavors. Okay, we see that over on the right here. Wheat-based dishes, noodles, steamed bread. However, Southern Chinese cuisine favors rice-based meals with lighter flavors. Okay, true story, right? So there is a contrast between these two cuisines. We can use, however, we can use, on the other hand, we can use by contrast. Now, interestingly enough, we can't use nevertheless. We'll cover why in the next lesson, okay? Nevertheless, even though it's part of this category and it's very similar to these other contrast words in some cases, they're not direct synonyms, unlike the addition transitions we looked at on the last slide, okay? So just make a mental note of that. And I hope you're taking notes, by the way, if you're not familiar with any of these transitions. If you see a transition in this lesson that you don't know or you don't feel 100% confident using, definitely make a note and definitely kind of make it a point to use that transition or be familiar with it, right? Okay. Should be pretty simple. These show the difference between the cuisines. Yeah, and you know, this last point, that's just what I was saying in terms of nevertheless, and there are some other contrast transitions that are in that same family as nevertheless that are subtly different. In many cases, they can replace um some of these others, but in other cases they can't. So cause and effect transitions. So these show the link between actions and their results. They're showing why something happened or what the consequences of that thing are, right? So we've got stuff like as a result, therefore, consequently, and for this reason. So some examples here. So many words from the now extinct Korepi language have been preserved through historical documents. Therefore, okay, because of this, modern linguists can use these records as foundations for reconstructing Kharipi. In other words, they're trying to create that language that's now an extinct language, and they can use documents like the one that we see on the right here that preserves some of those words. And so they're using those records and building the language back. So because these words have been preserved, therefore, right, as a result, for that reason, as a consequence of that fact, we can use those records to rebuild that language. Consequently, right, these are all synonymous, by the way. Okay. As a result, therefore, consequently, and for this reason. All right. So here again, we have a cause, right? The words have been preserved, and now we see the result. Because of that, we can use those records, those historical documents, to reconstruct that language. Okay, great. We're going to do a little exercise here. And yeah, work with me. So, what we want to do is we want to fill in these transitions into the appropriate box that they belong to, right? And so we've got our addition transitions, and obviously, in addition would be an easy way to start this. If you want, pause the video and try to do this on your own. I'll be kind of just solving it live. So, okay, because we've got additionally, I'm going to go ahead and say we can cross this off. And another addition transition that's pretty easy to find as we're looking through here is in addition, right? That's got addition in it immediately. Okay. Um, Other addition transition, there's a group. So furthermore, so you're adding, further is kind of like you're adding another point. And so is more, like I'm just adding more. So that furthermore, moreover, good way to notice that those two are linked in terms of the wording, right? More, right? Addition. So these are both also coming into our first category box. And this, if you've got a copy of my textbook, you'll see this chart in there. And this could be something good to kind of make a copy of, keep up on your wall. We've got another chart like this as well later in, well, we've got several more really in this chapter and in the next chapter. Okay, so I'm eliminating those. Okay, now I want to do my contrast. Now, obviously, the easiest thing to do is just by contrast right up at the top there. So I'm going to add that in. By contrast, has it right in the name. However, as our most common contrast word, right? So I'm going to add that in too. Hopefully you guys all know that and are comfortable with it. Pretty direct, pretty simple, I would say. Nevertheless, which we said was a kind of surprising contrast word because it is not actually a synonym with the others, which we'll talk about later. And then finally, on the other hand, yeah. And that in day-to-day speech, we often pair that with on the one hand and then on the other hand. So that does show contrast. That's got actually a pretty fascinating history of why we say that. So if anybody's curious, go and research. Why do we say on the one hand and on the other hand? It actually goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Cause and effect. So as a result, obviously, one thing is a result of the other. Consequently, right? One thing is a consequence of the other. It results from another thing. For this reason, the reason something happened, and therefore. So that brings us to the end of this little exercise. We'll be looking at a similar exercise a little bit later. Okay. All right. Let's move along. So now we're moving into part 2 of today's lesson. This is a very important moment in the lesson because we're going to talk about how to strategically approach transitions questions, okay? And the approach is a little bit different than it would be for other questions. The first thing that I want to say is do not look at the answer choices for this type of question too soon. And that's a strategy that's actually valid across a lot of the SAT because you don't want to ever kind of what I call poisoning the well. Remember, 3 of those answer choices are written by very smart people who want to bring you down the wrong path or confuse you. And so allowing yourself to like think about those answer choices too soon can often lead you astray. Okay. So instead of doing that, I'd like you to first read the entire passage carefully. And of course, this is a time permitting step, right? If you're rushing, maybe you have to make a skim. Maybe you just look at the 2 sentences that directly have, around the underline, right? Because those are the 2 most important. But time permitting, and especially on a harder question, you're going to want to read the entire thing because you can make mistakes by missing out on key details, especially later in a sentence. You're going to want to summarize the sentences before and after the blank in your own words, right? Because the blank is going to be between the 2 sentences that need to have need to have the transition. In the majority of cases, we'll talk about an exception to that in the next lesson. However, in probably 95% of cases, that's going to be what's going on. Make your summary short, clear, use your own words, right? Don't try to make them overly academic. And then you want to predict what transition is needed between the sentences. You can do that based on category, right? Say I need one of the categories we just talked about, contrast, addition, cause and effect. You can also just try to throw in your own transition there. However, as a result, for instance, and see if it makes sense. After you've made that prediction, and only then can you then go into the answer choices. You can look for a match, but you can just as easily try to eliminate wrong answer choices that don't match the category of the category that you predicted, or just the category that the transition you did predict was in. Go ahead and reread the passage, inserting your transition, and see if it makes sense in terms of logical relationship. So we're going to do that with a question here. Notice that the answer choice has been removed so you don't have the temptation to look. Let's go ahead and read this passage. So researchers at the University Medical Center Utrecht have found that scientific papers are using more positive description words than in previous years. They found that the use of words such as novel, amazing, and spectacular increased ninefold between 1974 and 2015. This trend could potentially skew the perceived importance of scientific findings. Okay. First of all, I'm going to say that there is definitely no contrast here, right? I'm seeing positive descriptive words, and then I'm just seeing in the next sentence positive descriptive words. So it's kind of following the same trend line, right? There's no contrast here. I'm not saying like, however, negative words also appeared or something like that. So I'm going to say this looks to be addition. Okay. So they found positive words. These are positive words, right? That's just a very simple way of describing these two sentences. All right. So they found scientific papers are using positive word. That's our sentence one summary. And that use actually increased over a time period. So we're just, to me, that is really a matter of definitely not contrast, maybe cause and effect, but let's think, okay, so, here I'm saying that there is an increase in positive words, and then we're getting more details about what words. Um, is there cause and effect? Well, therefore, because research papers are using more positive descriptive words, therefore they found the use of words increased. Be careful about that because it's not as if the research caused that trend, right? It just kind of reveals it. And so, yeah, always be careful about, especially cause and effect versus addition. On harder questions, you have to sometimes figure out a kind of subtle relationship that seems like it could be either one, but it often isn't cause and effect. Okay, so I would be careful about that. All right, so we're saying it's addition then. We could look for something like specifically, for instance, additionally, in fact, right? Those all belong to the broad addition category. So let's look for an answer choice that aligns with that. Here's the full question, and here are our options. Now I'm going to go ahead and eliminate by contrast right off the bat. We said that that couldn't be possible. I'm going to go ahead and also eliminate therefore, which is a cause-effect transition. Now, next and for example, both broadly belong to our addition category, okay, which I said is the biggest category and has the most words within it. Some of them fall into specifics, right? Specific like subcategories. Here, this is not an additional step in what they did, right? This is actually kind of an example of those positive descriptive words. So I'm going to say no to A, and our answer will be D. So now I'll read it. Researchers at the University Medical Center Utrecht have found that scientific papers are using more positive descriptive words than in previous years. For example, they found that the use of words such as novel, amazing, and spectacular increased ninefold between 1974 and 2015. So now I've reread it with my selected answer choice there. It sounds good to me, and it does make logical sense. Let's look at another question that's a little bit harder. We're going to follow the same steps, though, as we're solving it, okay? So here, and by the way, this is a harder question, so be aware. All right. So Madagascar's unique biodiversity has long posed a mystery due to a gap in its fossil record from 66 million to 26,000 years ago. Okay, so there's a mystery gap in a fossil record we don't know too much about. In my own words, we don't know too much about Madagascar's past. Paleontologist Karen Sammons and her team have begun to uncover fossils from this era, such as a 40 million year old sea cow that are leading to new insights into the island's evolutionary history. Okay, let's get our summary. There was a gap, right? Now we've got new discoveries that are filling in that gap. Okay, so first of all, is this therefore maybe it's a cause and effect because there was a gap? They have begun to uncover new fossils. I'm not so sure about that though, right? Um, is this just addition? There has been a gap. In addition, we've started to uncover fossils from that era. This seems like it's a separate point, right? It's not a pure addition because we're actually going against that. So I'm going to say that the type of transition we need is actually a contrast, right? All right, let's look at our answer choices then. So here are our answer choices brought in. I'm going to start eliminating some. I'm going to say that this is not an example of the gap in the fossil record, right? As posed a mystery. For example, we didn't know what happened 30 million years ago. No, this is not an example of that. Um, Likewise is an addition, so this would just be something similar. This is not similar, right? Likewise would be setting up we're bringing out a similar situation. Likewise, um, for example, likewise, Sri Lanka has also had a gap in its fossil record. No. And it's not because there was a gap that they've begun to uncover these fossils. So again, be careful about these cause and effect. Um, this didn't necessarily happen as a result of the gap. It's like not as if the gap caused them to uncover the fossils, right? This is actually a contrast. So, however, right, even though there was a gap, now we're starting to see fossils from this era. All right, let's look at some more questions here, and I'll just, if you want, take a pause the video and you can solve them before you hear our explanation. So go ahead and do that now if you'd like. Okay, so this is a fairly easy question, I would say. Here, Estonia rich, right, is kind of my summary for a sentence. And again, don't forget our strategy. Okay, I start showing students questions like this, and they quickly just go back to their old habit of like quickly looking at their answer choices. Don't do it. Okay, Estonia wealthy, Tajikistan poor. Contrast, right? Easy enough. It's not because Estonia is wealthy that Tajikistan is poor, right? We don't have any proof of that here. This isn't an example of the fact that Estonia is wealthy. It is a contrast. By the way, therefore, and as a result, do the same thing. And if you see that pattern, you can eliminate both. So as a result is also cause and effect like therefore. Okay, let's look at our next question here. And again, if you want to pause here in the video so that you can solve on your own, feel free to do that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and solve. So for many people, recognizing faces is automatic and effortless. Some lack this ability due to a condition known as developmental prosopagnosia, or face blindness. That was a mouthful. Harvard researchers found that the condition may be more common than previously thought, with up to 10 million Americans affected. Okay, so for many people, it's easy to recognize faces. Some, it's hard. That's kind of my summary, right? Just taking some notes here. Okay. By the way, you guys can feel free to take notes, especially in hard questions. You're allowed to have scrap paper on the SAT, and often top students use it. And I even use it, especially on hard inference questions, which we'll cover later in the series. Okay. So really, I'm noticing, again, this kind of what looks to me to be a contrast pattern, right? Um, so for many people, it's automatic and effortless, but for some, it's hard, right? So notice I said but. So this isn't an example of the fact that it's easy to recognize faces, right? For many people, recognizing faces is automatic and effortless. For example, when you go to breakfast downstairs at your house, you recognize your brothers or your sister and your parents, right? That would be an example of that. We don't show that here. In fact, would also be that kind of like interesting example or emphasis. In fact, it's so easy that we don't think about it. Okay. But no, again, here we have some contrast. Furthermore, some lack this. Okay, this is not a similar point, right? Furthermore is used to draw in a similar point, but this is actually something quite different. So this will be nevertheless. Even though it's automatic and effortless for many, some lack the ability. Okay, so we're showing contrast here and nevertheless does that. Let's move to our next question. Feel free to pause here if you would like before I solve. Okay, I'm going to read the question. Concerns over the waste generated by the plastic beads used in Mardi Gras celebration necklaces led molecular biologist Naohiro Kato to create an alternative made from microalgae. Production costs are high. Still, Kato believes the appeal of reducing plastic pollution can't be understated. He aims to produce 3,000 of his biodegradable necklaces for the next Mardi Gras. Okay, first thing is I'm noticing there is no contrast, right? He wants to reduce plastic pollution, but he aims to produce 3,000 biodegradable necklaces. No way. So I'm going to say that's out. Addition, okay, he believes the appeal can't be understated. Additionally, he aims to, maybe. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of nevertheless and however, though, because I'm saying um, no to contrast. Really, though, I'm thinking he believes this appeal can't be understated. In other words, he believes it's important to reduce plastic pollution. So we already had a contrast. Even though production costs are high, he believes it's important to reduce plastic pollution. Because he believes that, he aims to produce 3,000. In other words, we need cause and effect here. For this reason, C. It's not just an additional point, it's actually an effect of the previous point. Let's move to our next question. And again, feel free to pause here and solve on your own before I start my explanation. Okay. In her book, Cue the Sun, The Invention of Reality TV, television critic Emily Nussbaum explores the history of reality television, tracing its origins back to shows like Candid Camera. Nussbaum highlights how reality TV has evolved to incorporate elements of both contrivance and authenticity. She discusses the ethical questions surrounding the genre and the influence it has on its audience. Okay, this to me, I was going to say like in the book she does this, but obviously that's not going to be one of the transitions they're going to give me probably. So really, I'm not seeing any contrivance and authenticity, right? Contrivance means something fake. This just seems like an additional thing that she's doing. So I'm going to say something like additionally, in addition, I think I want an transition here. There's definitely no contrast. But what about cause and effect? She highlights this, therefore she discusses the ethical questions. Mm, she highlights how it has evolved to incorporate elements of contrivance, which is like falsity, right? Kind of like when they set up drama in a reality TV show on purpose, even though it wouldn't have naturally happened among the participants. Um, so I would say these ethical questions are related, but it's not necessarily a therefore. It's not necessarily saying because she highlights this, therefore she discusses the ethical questions, the questions of morality around it. So I'm going to say uh, no to a contrast, no to a cause and effect. Initially is a part of the broad addition category that shows sequence. So first we do initially means first, right? So first she does this. We don't have any sense that this would be the first thing that she did. So I'm going to eliminate that. And this is going to be furthermore. In addition would work as well. Moreover, additionally, those would all work here. Okay, let's move to our next question. So, and again, feel free to pause if you want to solve this on your own. All right, I'll start my solution. Giant squids, marine creatures that live in the depths of the ocean, are generally elusive, meaning we rarely see them. Most sightings involve deceased specimens caught in fishing nets. Okay, so a live giant squid was recently spotted swimming in the harbor northwest of Tokyo by a fisherman. This squid, possibly a juvenile, was filmed by a diver, providing a rare glimpse into the behavior of these mysterious creatures. Okay, so my sentence one summary. By sentence one, I just mean the sentence before the blank, right? I'm not saying the first sentence in the passage. Most sightings of giant squid, sadly enough, dead squid, right? Deceased specimens. Sentence two, live squid seen recently. Okay, so pretty obviously to me, this is not a therefore. There's no cause and effect between this. Is it an addition? Most sightings involve deceased specimens. Additionally, a live squid was seen? No, right? There's a direct contrast. Even though most are deceased or dead, we recently saw something alive. So I can eliminate, for example, moreover would just be providing an addition. It's not because most are dead that we saw a live squid. It's going to be contrast with however. Okay, hopefully that quiz went well for you. Yeah, and make sure that you're using our strategy throughout. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is we already kind of hinted at this, but there are subcategories, right, within the addition transitions. So we'll get to that shortly. Okay, let's pick back up here with our common addition transition. So now that we're getting into part three, we're just going to look and break down some of the different common addition transitions that you might see. So we already introduced addition transitions, but as I said, there were some subcategories that we wanted to get into. Let's go ahead and take a look. So first of all, I want to give you guys a warning, which is that actually I looked at every transition question on the release DSAT tests, and about half of them can be answered with one of 8 transitions. So we've got however, by contrast, for example, as a result, specifically, in fact, in addition, and for this reason. And interestingly enough, a lot of these are addition transitions. Like, for example, belongs to the addition category, sodas specifically, in fact, obviously, in addition does too. Okay. So the others are cause and effect for as a result and for this reason, and then contrast for however and by contrast. So make sure you're especially comfortable with those transitions by the end of this lesson, I should say. So yeah, just to reiterate too, if you're looking for that perfect score or near perfect score, try to learn as many transition words and phrases as you can. And we'll be doing that in the next lesson. We'll be going to even more. So just wanted to point that out. And as you're doing that, you'll want to look especially closely at transitions that have previously appeared on paper-based SATs, digital SATs, even ACTs, honestly. So looking around and finding as many transitions as you can and getting comfortable with them. Now, the most common transitions are addition transitions, okay? For example, and in fact, but as we noted, there are different types of addition transitions, and you're sometimes having to choose between different addition transitions. So we said we're thinking in categories, but sometimes you'll have two options that are in the same category, and we need to make distinctions between options in that same category. So we're going to talk about that now. So, as we're thinking about addition transitions, we've got four really common groupings. We've got adding information, which we already looked at. Furthermore, in addition, we've got example transitions, like for example and for instance, emphasis transitions like indeed, and restatement transitions like in other words. So we're going to go into all those in a little bit more detail here. Adding information is our broadest group and our simplest group, and we've already talked about those. Okay, so I'm not going to go into detail on those here. Let's go into example and specifics transitions. So our example transitions just give us a way of indicating that we're providing support for the information in the previous sentence or illustrating that information, right? So you're providing evidence that backs up an idea. So these are often used to help readers understand something more deeply by providing examples, easy as that, or just specific evidence. For example, and for instance, are our common transitions here. So The Void, the world's first virtual reality theme park, will employ VR helmets, gloves, and vests to immerse participants in a variety of scenarios. For example, okay, now the reader is going to expect to see what kinds of scenarios we're talking about. And indeed, this sentence does that. Scenarios, participants can explore haunted castles or battle on futuristic fields. So these are examples of those scenarios. We could have also used for instance here, right? Exact same meaning for these two. Now for specifics transitions, these are giving specific information, right? And sometimes these overlap with our examples, right? A variety of scenarios specifically, right? Participants can explore haunted castles or battle on futuristic fields. That could work. In other cases, it's slightly different. So the most common specifics transition is just specifically, has specifics right in the name, or specific right in the name. But I want us to look at one that's a little bit harder, okay? So I'm going to show you guys a question here on our next slide, and I'll just read it out. Again, we're not going to look at the answer choices too soon. And I'll tell you that we're looking for a specifics transition while we're solving it. So William Shakespeare's first published work, the 1593 narrative poem Venus and Adonis, was not the career-launching success that he or publisher Richard Field might have hoped for, and critics disparaged it, right? Meaning they criticized it. They noted that the poem borrowed heavily from Latin poet Ovid and lacked stylistic coherence. So this is giving us examples or details about how they disparaged it, right? And so we do want a specifics transition here. All right. Now, I'll say there's no contrast there, right? So we could eliminate that. They disparaged it or criticized it, therefore they noted the poet did these things. Not really, right? There's no cause and effect. So I can get rid of any contrast or cause and effect here. And that's going to let me get rid of. Now, you guys may not be familiar with some of these words, and I'm trying to introduce them for that reason, okay? So these are all kind of hard answer choices. So I'm going to get rid of hence. Hence is a cause and effect transition that is the same as therefore or thus or for this reason, okay? So be aware of hence. It's just a fancy, older way of saying therefore. Definitely know it. Even so shows contrast, right? I wanted to go outside. Even so, I decided not to, right? So you're showing contrast. And so I can eliminate this as well. With that in mind means that you've got a particular thing that you're thinking about, right? So this would show a related point. They disparaged it with that in mind. Publisher Richard Field decided not to publish any of Shakespeare's future poetry, for example, right? Doesn't exactly work here. We're looking for something that means specifically and actually namely has the same meaning, right? It shows a particular reason that they did disparage it. or a particular aspect of the poem that they disparaged. And that's what we see here. The poem borrowed heavily. That was a particular way, a specific way that they disparaged or criticized it. So this will be B, namely. Emphasis transitions, they're similar to example transitions, but they actually want to highlight just how important a pointer statement is. And so they're adding emphasis to what came before. Um, I often give the example, Bangkok, Thailand is one of the world's hottest cities. In fact, the World Meteorological Agency declared it the hottest major city in the world, right? That would give um, a statement that emphasizes the information that came before. So here, our most common emphasis transitions are indeed and in fact. Let's look at some examples. So, Singaporean painter Georgette Chen was often overlooked due to her gender and the dominance of Western centric art movements. Indeed, her work was not fully appreciated until a major survey done by the National Gallery Singapore in 2020. So, this is emphasizing how overlooked she was, that her work was not really appreciated until 30 years after her death, right? We could also say, in fact, here, right? Same meaning. So this second sentence is just emphasizing the extent to which that first sentence is true. So this is kind of like strengthening the claim made in the previous sentence. Restatement transitions are used just to re-say something that has already been said in order to clarify it, right? You're thinking, well, why would I just want to restate the exact same thing? Well, they're often using different wording, and that's why the most common restatement transition is actually in other words. For hard questions, especially, I would lean toward restatement transitions because the test sometimes relies on your inability to see that it's simply representing the same the previous sentence in a new way. Okay, so as you're moving into your hard questions, and those are often the last couple of transition questions or the hardest, especially in the hard module, these are often good answer choices. So our most common one is in other words. Let's look at a question and we'll see another common restatement transition here. So the farming of ostriches in the United States has experienced periodic surges of popularity, but in spite of initial enthusiasm, each boom has inevitably crashed due to a lack of sustained demand for ostrich products. Um, Ostrich farming in America can be described as a recurring agricultural bubble because it has that boom bust cycle. So there's a boom bust cycle. We can describe it as a bubble. This is kind of adding information. I mean, we could potentially say therefore here, or this could be a restatement, right? Boom and bust means expanded and then it popped, right? So that is a bubble. Um, in other words would definitely work here, but we don't have an in other words answer here. I'm going to get rid of nonetheless, which shows contrast. It's just like nevertheless, okay, which we've already seen. There's no contrast here. Um, Admittedly shows that you're kind of accepting something that goes against your argument. And we'll talk about that more in the next lesson, but admittedly is admitting something that goes against what you are trying to prove. In other words, um, I really want to see the new Spider-Man movie. Admittedly, the reviews haven't been very good, right? So even though I want to see it, I'm admitting something that goes against that previous argument. We'll come around to those more. By the same token is shows a similarity in the same way, but this isn't just in the same way or a similarity between the two statements. This is a restatement of what came before. And so actually that is the same as in other words. It shows that you're simply restating what came previously. And that'll be our correct answer. Okay, so now we're going to look at a little exercise similar to the one that we did earlier in this lesson. We're just kind of filling in these categories. I think if you want to pause the video here and do it on your own or do it in the textbook and come back, that is fine. Um, What I would actually start with here, I'm gonna go ahead and solve, but I would start with your example in specific because those are the easiest to see. Like, for example, obviously belongs to this category. So I'm just gonna add that in, for example. Um, and even I could add in this, which means the same thing, for instance, right? So I'm just gonna go ahead and eliminate those. And for specifics, I've got specifically. And we said during the lesson in that Shakespeare example, right, that namely also belongs to that category, showing that kind of very strong example. So I'm going to eliminate namely. And there's one other one that we didn't cover in the lesson, but maybe you could have figured out. It's in particular, right? So that is like the same thing as specifically. For emphasis, we had two that we talked about that mean the same thing. Those are indeed and in fact. So I'm going to eliminate those. And then obviously for restatement and clarification, we had that is and in other words. Right, sounds good. Let's move along. So now we're at the end of the lesson. I'll just give you some final tips. And this is just kind of a summary of what we've learned. Make sure you know your categories. Make sure that you're identifying the relationship before you look at your answer choices, summarizing the sentences before and after the blank, right? In the simplest possible language. Do not skip these steps. Um, Make sure that you're making that prediction, whether it's a prediction about category or a specific word that you want to use. And you can use process of elimination like I did throughout the lesson, where you're kind of eliminating things that are impossible, like contrast, as you work through. So yeah, eliminating those mismatches, like no contrast, remove contrast, no cause effect, eliminating stuff like therefore and for this reason. And then go ahead and put your word in the passage and read it back to yourself. Does it make sense? Great. If it doesn't, you may want to pick something different or start from the beginning again. Okay, guys, that was the end of today's lesson. Hope you came away with a lot of great information, and we'll be building on a lot of the same information in our next lesson, which is on advanced transitions. So we'll be looking at more addition transitions like rare categories, other categories of contrast, as well as looking at some very specialized transition words and phrases.